Today's episode of Professional Confession is brought to you by the Multicultural Insights Collective, whose project Words Matter analyzes the shifting and dynamic language of diversity and inclusion to help marketers and corporations navigate and speak more effectively across diverse populations. For more information, you can visit their website at voicesofequity.com or email them at info@voicesofequity.com. Hello, and welcome to Professional Confession, a podcast where we talk about the implications and solutions to issues of diversity in the workplace. I'm your host, Damion Taylor. Today's episode, we'll be talking about accents. Yep, that's right. We're talking about the way we speak. We happen to have a very special expert guest who knows a thing or two about accents today. But before we get to our guest, let's jump right into this week's confession. Today's confession comes from a marketing strategist. I'm a marketing strategy consultant and have been in my career for about 10 years. A major portion of my job is presenting and public speaking. Both skills have always been pretty natural to me. I don't know when I first noticed it, however, but pretty early on in my career, I realized that no matter what I presented, whether it be mundane performance reporting or exciting new insights, I seemed to get the same feedback or some iteration of it. It was always, "Wow, you speak English so well. Where are you from? Are you from England?" Or, "Wow, you're so articulate." To provide you with some context, I'm from California. Undeniably so. There's no scenario where my accent can be mistaken for anything from the UK. I also happen to be Black. In all fairness, there were some comments about the content of my presentations, and for some reason, the way I speak always seemed to be the most consistent feedback. I noticed that my Caucasian colleagues didn't get the same feedback, even when they may have been the most eloquent and engaging speaker on the stage by far. Then one day, after traveling across the country, quite literally in a different city for every day of the week, I had enough and needed to finally vent. So while waiting at the airport for my flight home with my colleagues, Harvey and Marla, I unleashed my exasperated confusion. Why does everyone think I'm from another country? Seriously, what is it that after my presentations, the only thing people have to say is, "You speak so articulately. Where are you from?" Harvey and Marla stared at me, then at each other, then at me again. Finally, Marla spoke up and said, "Well, it's because you're Black and you sound like a white guy." Honestly, I was shocked that she said that. I shouldn't have been. Marla was actually my boss and pretty blunt about everything, which is actually why I loved working with her so much, but I just didn't expect her to have noticed it too. Marla continued, "Listen, you're very good at what you do and everything about you breaks with people's expectations. Honestly, after I spoke to you on our first phone interview, I expected to see a white guy walking in, but then it was you. Totally not a bad thing, though. Now that you know about this, it's something you could totally use to your advantage. Heck, I'm a white woman and all I get are comments about how impressive I am with numbers or questions about how hard it must be leading a team of men. But now that I know what people expect of me, I can leverage it to my advantage." Listening to Marla, I have to admit I was stunned. But then Harvey spoke up and said I wasn't the only one getting the comments as well. You see, Harvey was Asian, but he and his parents, like me, were born in California. But apparently whenever he spoke, presentation or not, he got the same comments about how good his English was or where was he from. His responses, of course, tended to be a little bit more sarcastic than mine, with things like, "It should be, it's the only language I know." But either way, it was equally as frustrating to him. After my shock wore off, I was actually very happy to be able to share with my colleagues all of the pent-up emotions I had been experiencing. I was even more relieved that they understood. We ordered some drinks at the bar while we waited for our plane and laughed about it, but despite commiserating, it still doesn't make it any better. I just wonder that if people have so low expectations about my ability to speak, what other preconceived notions could they possibly have about me before I even step on stage or interact with them? So that was our story for today, and today we have a very special guest who's going to help us break that down and talk about it. We have Sandra Grandsoult from Equitas Insight. She's a really, really awesome insights research professional who has a very strong and I think very helpful perspective when it comes to the world of diversity and insights. So I would love to say welcome to Sandra. Thank you so much for being on the show with us. We really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Damion. It's lovely to be here.
So you heard that story. It's a very interesting story. And I'm assuming you being in the US, having an English accent, of course, is something that your accents are very familiar to you. What's your first reactions to hearing that story?
So I would say the word that springs to mind is relatable. It's relatable in so many ways, and not just for me, but so many other stories I've heard from people that I know. So I think it's an important topic. I'm glad we're talking about it. What I would also say is that there's a lens on this story for me that spans differently across my experience, because you obviously can hear that my accent is English. I was born in the UK. I spent most of my life and career in the UK up until kind of 10 years ago when I moved to the US. And it's been very interesting just even observing how I am perceived and my accent and my language is perceived in the UK versus the US. So, we'll talk about that a little bit more later.
So jumping right into this story, I think the one thing that for me really stood out was that it was the pervasiveness of the comments, that our person here didn't get, oh, wow, that's such a great insight. It's such a helpful insight, or wow, that really got me thinking. It was always about, wow, you speak English so well. And it's someone from California, and I'm from California. Clearly, our accents aren't the same and don't sound alike. But there is this idea that you have to be something other than what I perceive a Black American to be.
Yes.
From your perspective, what did you hear that really stood out to you kind of first?
So, and I think that's at the heart of the issue. The heart of the issue is that there is a lot of stereotyping, and there is a lot of presumption and assumption. We all have unconscious bias. I think it's a human condition. I think the challenge is that most of us don't have a level of self-consciousness, a level of self-awareness. We don't seek to educate ourselves. And so we tumble into this chaos time after time. This poor person in the story, time after time, traveling, doing, daily presentations, getting the same feedback. That's because society has found it acceptable to just, live outside of this level of consciousness. And I feel like that's the challenge here. The challenge to us all as professionals is to raise the game, raise the bar in terms of understanding that, bias and stereotyping is a human condition, and it's up to us to own it and to do something about it at an individual level. I mean, it's interesting. My own experience is, obviously, when I came to the US, I present as Black American. So I was looked at as a Black American. And when I spoke, suddenly the reaction changed. If I went to dinner with my husband is, he's I want to say Black American, but he's lived in America for 42 years of his life, but actually he's from Guyana in South America. So he has a sort of, American accent with a little bit of something else, but he presents as Black American. We would go to a restaurant together. He would, lead us in, and so, the reaction would be, very much kind of looking over his shoulder at the person behind who was white, if we were somewhere nice. And so, it got to a point where he would put me in front, because when I spoke, everything changed. It was, oh, can I take your coat? So it was just so interesting to me. And that and I feel that is a real problem, because it really just highlights the importance of dealing with this. It's not acceptable for you to see race first and then seek to qualify it, which this is what sounds like, was the situation with this consultant. If I show up as Black, or I show up as Asian, and the expectation is that I don't have the same intellectual capacity, I don't have the same linguistic skills, therefore, wow, well done you.
And it's funny, I think the interesting thing about it, there are two things in here that are interesting to me about it. The first is, it feels like if I think about just in the context of a career and work, that person, that consultant, feels like the bar is set so much lower for them, and that their work isn't valued. It's like their bar of entry is, oh, you can speak. right? Whereas everyone else seems to be, you have to know something to be able to do something. The other piece that's really interesting, and I mean, equally as disheartening in this, is that the lack of awareness that people have about the comments that they're making. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing to tell someone that they're articulate or they're a great speaker, but it's the pervasiveness of it. And it sounds like the people with whom this consultant's interacting aren't aware of their biases, right? And so it's that lack of awareness as well, that combined with the way that the person feels about like the low bar, that make it particularly difficult. In your opinion, what do you see as being sort of the potential impact on a career or someone's morale when they're dealing with this on an ongoing basis?
I think ultimately it erodes your self-esteem over time. I think inevitably that is what happens, because there is this sense that, you have to work twice as hard, be twice as good to even get to vaguely the same place. And even then, the perception will still be, well done you, not for your intellect, but well done you because you've surpassed my expectations of what normal is. And so, I think, the inevitable consequence is you do not progress as quickly. And some of that is, and it's interesting, there's this tension between the, what I would call kind of how we show up visually and the biases that are associated with that. The tension between that and how we speak. We're talking about accents and linguistics. And I think that both of those biases they happen separately, but they also happen together. And I think for a Black professional, I think there's a double whammy there, because the duality of it, I think, causes a greater challenge. And I think that's the stuff that limits careers, because you might get bypassed because you're Black, or you might get bypassed because you're not, if you're not a really fluent, we're talking about somebody who was a really fluent English speaker, but if you weren't, you could be completely, super smart in a particular area, but you may not progress because you don't have the linguistic skills. So I feel like, this whole thing about diversity, equity, and inclusion is really about trying to, each of us, create a level of self-awareness, self-consciousness, and a real intentionality about making the change, because the only people that can own it is the individual. And right now, individuals are not motivated, they're not incentivized, because, there's also this sense that, for this consultant to do well and to, I have to give something up if I'm white.
Yeah.
So, so there's that tension as well. So there are a lot of reasons to try and keep the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think people necessarily do it consciously. I don't think, this consultant would have been, approached with somebody kind of saying, oh, intentionally, I really want to keep you down.
Yeah.
That's why I'm going to give you this feedback. That was impact felt, but not necessarily impact intended. But the impact is there because over years and years and years, that's how they've been brought up. That's how they see society. Mm-hmm. Those are the accepted norms. And so you're a product of the accepted norms in society. And so it's I think it's a challenge, but I think, the real, coming back to kind of the question, what is the impact? The impact is, I think it is very, very distressing, very disturbing, and very limiting for the individual, because it erodes your self-esteem, it limits your career progression, and again, your own self-worth, which I think is fundamentally the biggest issue.
Definitely. Yeah. The thing that was also interesting is once he spoke to his boss, she actually had a different version of intersectionality, right? I'm a woman and people don't think I'm smart enough, and how can I handle all of these men? And it makes me wonder what would have happened if she would have been a Black woman. I mean, how much more compounded would that have been? It feels like there's so much to unpack. And on one hand, you understand why this is so difficult, and we can't kind of build a one size fits all. Look, we fixed diversity. Yay. But on the other hand, it really speaks to something you mentioned earlier, which is seeing the individual and being able to see people as whole people and not as groups or monoliths, or simplifying things to whatever we think the lowest common denominator is so that we can move more quickly in the world. From, I think, another perspective, there's the interesting connection between the two coworkers, the Asian coworker and the Black coworker. And you've probably seen some of this in the workplace as well, where you end up with sometimes this battle between marginalized groups for attention. And so versus seeing each other as allies or as being in the same boat. There's
solidarity, right?
Yeah, there's very little solidarity sometimes. Sometimes it's literally a competition for, no, see me, no, not them, me. I'm more marginalized than you. How do you, in your opinion, how have you seen this play out? And did you see anything interesting in that interaction here that was a little bit different than what you had seen before?
No, again, I think this, what struck me in the story, which I think is a reflection of real life. What struck me in the story is the individual pain that is felt and the individual pain that is kept silently. If you think about kind of our consultant experienced this a zillion times over before saying, I've got to speak out. Meanwhile, they've been working with this coworker for the longest while who also isn't speaking out. So it may not be that, again, it's intentional, but there is this quiet pain and this high level of endurance, and almost there's an expectation from the individual that it is yours to endure. And so you don't get the solidarity that would make this better for everybody and create, I guess, more of a ripple about, affecting change and speaking out and having courageous conversations. So, that was, the story in itself, I think, struck me as, this, again, having been there, I've, always been the N equals, 1 in the room, particularly in my career when I was based in the UK, much more so. And so you get used to it and you get used to the quiet pain, and you live with it. So what's great is this courageous conversation happened. The boss got engaged, provided, again, own perspective. So started a courageous conversation, started a level of self-awareness, started, again, a level of solidarity between those three people.
It's funny. You mentioned something that's really important. I think there's that quiet pain piece. It's something that I don't think people often think about. And I've worked with a couple of movie studios, and there's always people are watching this show or people like it. No one said anything. But the absence of a comment or the absence of some sort of a decrying rally around something doesn't mean that there isn't some sort of harm being caused. It's really sometimes I know that I'm here. I'm the only one. And so we don't know when this chance is going to happen again. So just deal with it so that you can maintain this status and hopefully help someone else. And I think that's it's something that's often overlooked in corporate world, especially, just because the assumption is if you didn't complain, then there's
everything's okay.
Exactly. And it struck me because just recently I was speaking to someone who was early in their career and was going through something similar, and then started to realize that we had very similar experiences in working. And her comment was, someone told me I should go to HR and talk about this, but culturally, she's like, as Black people, we're taught to deal with the person individually, right? It's not, don't make this someone else's problem. You talk to them and see if the two of you can resolve it. And so she just felt very uncomfortable doing that, which is, it's something, until she mentioned that culturally, it's something that I hadn't thought of, but it's very true. It was always, my mom would tell me, deal with that person first, make sure you understand it and you guys can work it out. And then if you can't, then you go someplace else. And she just felt like she was failing and being sort of the tattletale and not handling things in a mature manner by going straight to HR. But her boss was telling her, no, go straight to HR. That's an HR issue. I think this is another one of those things where it's the quiet pain.
That's a cultural lean, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a cultural lean too, which is, again, the expectation. It comes back to this endurance, which again goes back to our history, which is, built to endure to some degree. There's real facts about that. The fact that, in the medical world that, we are perceived to feel pain to we have a higher threshold for pain. Where does that come from?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily a threshold. It's just that endure it, swallow the bitter pill, and keep going.
And it's not a reality either. You should see me.
Yeah,
trust me, it's not a reality. But and so I think this history of independently owning, independently kind of trying to carve your way, independently working 3 times as hard to get to the same place and accepting that that is the norm, creates a scale of resilience. And therefore, that scale of resilience then, again, means you are never able to get support.
That's very true.
It's this kind of chicken and egg.
Mm-hmm. It's virtuous loops that keeps feeding itself, right? But on one hand, it's kind of interesting that the boss mentions that this is something you can leverage to your advantage, right? If people have low expectations of them, do something that's going to not just be better, but even slightly better than what your competitor would do, and you look like an amazing rock star, right? And it's something that I don't know. I know I've done that in my career before. I don't think they're going to expect much of me. So you just do a little bit more than you think they would expect, and people suddenly think you're amazing. But it's also a little bit, I would say, disheartening, right? Because then you're probably going, well, do I just do the bare minimum, or like what? It kind of builds that. It takes away your desire to want to do more and excel.
Yeah, I agree. And again, I hear that. I hear it in the story, and I hear it played back in real life a lot too, because again, we are self-motivated individuals. We are kind of all here to fulfill a purpose. That's what, gets us all up in the morning. And so to have to subdue your purpose, or to compromise on your purpose, or to compromise on how high is up, again, that's a loss for the individual. That's a loss for a team and organization. That's a loss for society. And so it kind of, that what you've just said to some degree breaks my heart, because it's like, why should any individual, be less than they know they can be?
Yeah, no, that
because society doesn't expect much. We all know that, when you set a high bar, then that person is going to go, is going to excel because the bar is high. So if you have a low bar set, that comes back to, I'll never even know how great I can be, because I've never had to stretch myself to that level because the bar's so low.
Yeah, no, exactly.
So everyone loses, right?
Yeah, it's not necessarily good for anyone. And sometimes I think that's the thing that's hard to communicate to others, is that when you put someone in that box and set the bar low, you lose out as well, because they may actually at some point be able to challenge you and help you to grow.
Exactly.
One of the things that's really interesting about this is that I feel like there are solutions to this that we could actually implement in the workplace. You're much deeper in this than I am, and much better at it. Just coming from you, what would you say, like in terms of advice, what would you say are potential ways that we can start to work this, or even an individual in their company can start to work towards solving these types of issues?
So, I mean, I would start with, what I think are the fundamentals, and the fundamentals, are about courageous conversations. It is really, really hard when something like this keeps happening to an individual to suck it up. It's really, really hard. But in order to prevent it, it does require a courageous conversation. So I would encourage people to actually lean in. And, particularly our consultant clearly does know how to handle himself in conversations, and is a great communicator. So again, can really leverage. So that point about, leverage the skill, can leverage that skill to create and facilitate a conversation that could be very uncomfortable, but actually they have that skill, that prowess to be able to do that. Perhaps more so than a white counterpart who is not as skilled a communicator. So it's a perfect example of using that skill. But I think it is fundamental to have the conversation, to talk about, and again, I think one of the things that I think is, it's not just the what but the how. To talk about, to have this conversation in the context of impact felt versus impact intended. So it's not accusatory. It's thank you for that great feedback. I really appreciate it. I'd like to share with you kind of, some of how it made me feel. It might not have been your intention, but when people do say things like this, it feels like this. No one can argue with your feelings. Mm-hmm. They can't say, no, you didn't feel like that. So I think there are little techniques like that you can use to start to have the conversations. The other thing that I think is another opportunity that we, again, maybe also don't don't leverage as potentially as fully as we can is allyship. And that's not allyship in a broad sense, but it's, finding an ally that that you can help, they can help you to be heard. They can help your message to be communicated more broadly. They can help cause the ripple and be more in step with you and champion for you. Because I think there is a reality of kind of like crossing the bridge, because you can create solidarity with, again, people like me, and we can kind of all create this nice little ripple which says, okay, we're all in pain together. But actually, that's not the goal. Mm-hmm. The goal is to create a psychologically safe environment for everybody, which means we've got to get to a place of mutual understanding of how we cooperate together for the greater good, which does mean crossing the bridge. So that, I think it's not ideal that we should have to do that. But I think the reality is somehow we've got to engage, white people in this conversation. We've got to have them advocate, not just empathize. Mm-hmm. So, and ask for what you want. Ask an ally, can you do, if you see this situation, can you do this? Because I think that often allies don't know what to do. I mean, a client of mine we were talking about equity in the workplace, and, again, he's a white male, senior leader. And one of the things that, he talked about was, he sort of lived his life and lived his career with a level of, a low level of awareness of what it might feel like to be, a Black person in America or a Black profession in America, mm-hmm. and kind of got to this point, saying then, and then I got to this point of awareness, but then I just didn't know what I could do to help. So there is this sense that allies, there's an assumption that allies know what to do, why aren't they doing it? But actually, in reality, like, I want to do something, but I'm scared of saying the wrong thing. I'm scared of doing the wrong thing. So I'm in paralysis. And so that's what I mean about the bridge is everything. And the bridge comes from those courageous conversations and from asking for what you need, which I think as humans, we all find difficult to do, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's easier said than done, of course. I mean, if you think about it, to some extent, you have to make yourself vulnerable to say, hey, I need your help.
Absolutely. And I think what it does create is shared vulnerability, because I think there's vulnerability everywhere. And so if you can facilitate that conversation in the same way that, our consultant would share, I felt this way, the white colleague may say, well, I was, I didn't know what to say, so I was trying to say something nice. And suddenly you've got this sort of shared vulnerability, this empathy, because everyone knows that we're trying to do the right thing. And then you can have a conversation about, well, next time, how could we handle it differently? And I think it's interesting, because I think in these conversations, the diagnosis is all is easy, kind of go, this went wrong, that went wrong. And then people kind of walk away feeling better because we talked about it. But actually to me, the secret sauce is when you then say, if this happens again, or if you see this situation again, here's a suggestion of how we could handle it differently.
I think that's powerful.
Everyone knows, mm-hmm. right? Everyone knows what good looks like, because we have to rewire the brain. Everybody's brain is now wired to this kind of stereotyping, that's what we do. Yep. That's what we do. We do it in autopilot. So we've got to unwire the brain and start practicing new behaviors. Yeah,
it's sort of the first step is, the pat on the back. Like, look, we talked about it, but then what do you do about it? It's taking that next step. And it's, interestingly, it's probably the one that's more difficult, because it's I have to be brave enough to be vulnerable and actually make a change.
Yeah. And I have to ask for what I need.
Yeah. And all of those things.
Which we don't like doing.
Well, and if you think about American culture, especially, that asking for something is to some extent a sign of weakness, right? Exactly. I'm not in a power position because now I've had to ask for help. And so someone is going to have something over me. And that can be a difficult thing for a lot of people to do, especially for men. If we're thinking of men doing it, like, yes. If you think of, this is where intersectionality comes back into play. The dynamic of what it is to be a man is self-sufficient, really strong. You don't need help. You do it all on your own. You're, the sort of big frontierman, whatever mentality. But in reality, that doesn't necessarily get you where you want to be. When you look at the best salesmen, for example, they're always asking for what they need. That's their job, and they're very good at it. And that's how they do well. And so
it's absolutely right.
It's being aware of all of those biases that you have, because to your point earlier that we all have biases and they're all unconscious. And so it's becoming aware and starting to really address them and decouple them from our actions. And once you're aware, it's not just knowing about it, but it's how are you reacting and responding and changing in accordance with that.
Yeah. And I think some of the asking as well is also, asking for things that everybody should be doing. So as well as the kind of individual situation, I think education is everything here. I, coming from the UK, have actually had to self-educate on, Black American history. I have had to consciously do that because, I know colonialism, but I did not know, Black American history in the same level of depth as I do now. And there'd be so many. My husband's kind of been my kind of educator through my my time here, because it's so interesting. Like a common language, two countries with a common language. Culturally, we could not be more different. It's been quite a journey, and some of that journey is for me to personally have had to understand what it is to be Black in America. And it still hurts. It hurts a lot. It's, I've not felt the same type of pain being Black in England as I have being Black in America, because I guess I feel like it's not that it's not there. It's very much there, but, we're a bit more kind of covert. We're a bit more, let's all have a cup of tea and it'll all be all right. And we'll sweep it under the carpet. So, whereas I think, in the US, it is all more, particularly obviously in recent years, it is all overt, but I think also the consequences are so much more severe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's what is, for me personally, a little bit scary. And again, I will say this out loud. I, when I was living in the US, in the UK, I just drove about all the time, every day, drove to work, didn't ever think anything of it. I limit the time that I am in a motor vehicle driving because of a fear that I have, because of, again, what I've seen, about how Black people are treated. And it's irrespective of your profession, your career, how well all of those things do not matter. You don't get that far. And so I think that, those consequences, it must affect how you are in the workplace. It must affect how you show up. It must affect your fears and your anxieties and what you are and aren't prepared to speak up about. So I feel it's a tricky time, but courageous conversations are really the only way that we're going to start to move and start to heal.
And you bring up an interesting point. When I was younger and in college, I went to go study abroad. I had that same experience that you mentioned, right? I came from the U.S. and for the most part, up until that point, I hadn't really thought too much about it. I just knew that my dad and my uncle had both been police officers. And so there were the protocols you follow. Keep your hands on the steering wheel. Always say yes or no, sir. All of these very strict things. And my mom was like, don't have too many people in your car at the same time. And anything that might make you stand out so someone would notice you. And if you get pulled over, this is exactly what you do. And so that was just it. And then I remember living in Spain. And then when I went to go visit the UK, I remember writing back to my friends and my family saying it's different here. And pointing out that there's racism, it's covert. It's sort of like the nice neighbor who says a little snarky comment to you. And I said, and that's fine, because I'm much more able to deal with that versus you just mistook me for, some suspect between 4'11" and 6'1" who happened to be Black and now you're going to shoot me, right? That's a very different level of awareness and anxiety.
And consequence.
Exactly,
right?
Exactly. And I remember for a while I was telling my family that I'm not coming back home. I didn't want to go back just because just having for a moment something that felt more like, I don't want to say it felt more like freedom, but it felt more like I could live a little bit less guarded. Was okay. In this case, I felt like all I had to worry about was well, now I just have to worry about people thinking I'm dumb. And I can overcome that because I'm not. So that was okay, right? But my life wasn't threatened in that sense.
And I think, Damion, what you've said reading an article a couple of months ago that talked to that subject precisely. It was a number of expats, US people that were living in Europe, and some of the references they were making was like, it's amazing not to have the talk with my child. So it was just that sense of freedom, that sense of relief, that some of those things that are just a part of normal behavior, normal life, being Black in America, actually suddenly disappear.
Yeah.
But as you say, it's still there. It's still prevalent. It's dealt with differently, but I think it feels like relief because the consequences are not as severe. And to your point, it's more manageable. I just got to prove I'm smart.
Exactly. It's a very different scenario. But it's interesting because I think what this story brought out for me is that it's complicated. It's not something that you can fix with just a 2-hour class on diversity and equity, right?
Absolutely.
It's a process, and you have to keep working through it. And the thing that I think so often we forget, especially being in insights and research, is we're talking to people on the other end, not numbers, not stats. And so it's seeing the humanity in front of you and not the X% of people who are.
Yes. And it's doing it, again, as we are as insights professionals, it's doing it the right way, which is also getting the representation right, getting all voices heard. Because I do think that in our profession, there's still a lot of sort of traditional approaches in terms of sampling. So you're going to hear who you speak to.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's, one of the things that is really important is that it's not just about within the workplace that we, really become inclusive, really appreciate the diversity of each other and value the diversity of others, but actually that we bake it into everything that we're doing. So, how do we do sampling in research? How do we, approach our methodologies so that, we're talking about race a lot, but, if you have disabilities, how appropriate is our methodology and our approach for your disability? Taking that all the way through to communications when we're representing people in advertising. Right now we have a lot of what I would call, and I will say it, token Black. Or a token Asian. There is a lot of tokenism. Those people, it's almost like the script was the script, and we took the white person out and we put someone, person of color instead, but it's not authentic.
Mm-hmm.
It's not authentic representation. And that is even more off-putting than actually not doing it at all.
Yep.
And so, so it's just being able to really be thoughtful and be intentional about what do we really mean if we want to be inclusive? Where does it show up in our organization, in our strategies, in our business processes, internally and externally? And then again, what are we going to do with intentionality and with time? You made absolutely the critical point about this will not be fixed in 5 minutes. The history tells us that, the history shows us that. But I think, now is the time. I do feel that there is such a level of awareness and consciousness. I think there are allies out there who genuinely want to help. And if they could be guided as to how they can help, we could create some critical mass that could make a change.
Definitely. Well, I want to say thank you so much for being on this show. If you would like, tell people where they can find you and where they can learn more about your work.
Oh, thank you. Yes. No, I'd love to. So the company is called Equitas Insight. And we are a consultancy, so it's a insights and strategy consultancy specializing in diversity, equity, inclusion. And that's everything, if I kind of give examples of the types of work we do everything from diversity and equity strategy and planning, so working with heads of DEI, working with C-suite to try and help them to really, say what is it that we need to be doing differently, from purpose through to strategy through to all executional plans. We do capability building and sort of education. So beyond the unconscious bias training, it's what do we really need to do that is a capability building plan to get everybody to this kind of shared sense of what a psychologically safe environment is like, what are the do's and don'ts, etc. And then we also work with brand teams, so working with insights teams to think about inclusive insights, What do we have to do in our methodologies and our processes? How does that translate through into the creative brief, into the output, into the measurement, into the effectiveness? So I think the way that we think about it is we fundamentally believe that by doing good, it equals doing well. So, and so what we're interested in is using the principles of equity to basically grow brands, grow people, grow business.
That's awesome. And I know I've seen some of your work and I'm very excited about it. I hope people, if you have time, please check out Equitas Insights. I'll put all of the info in the liner notes so that you can click and enjoy their website and learn. It's really great work. It's really useful. And as you've heard, it's helping us to unpack a lot. This is a very big and it's a very interconnected and complicated issue. And so it takes time, and having these courageous conversations is really an important part of it. So thank you so much, Sandra. It's been great.
Thank you, Damion. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.